This morning's report caps off my first year as president. And over that period, our economy created 6.6 million jobs. It's never happened before. And look, history's been made here.
Our nation's economic recovery continues to be, let there be no doubt, the strongest in the world.
We're seeing businesses, we're seeing employees, we're seeing people learning to live and move on with their life, quite honestly, under the virus.
All right, a roundup of some of the comments on today's good jobs report numbers. Let's bring in our panel to discuss that and more. Byron York, chief political correspondent of the Washington Examiner. Kimberly Strassel, a member of the editorial board at the Wall Street Journal. And Josh Kraushaar is politics editor for National Journal. Welcome to all of you. Good news for this White House at a time they really need it, but it stands in contrast, and this is something that Charlie Gasparino touched on earlier, with how people are actually feeling. I mean, gas is at a 7-year high. The prices for, groceries and all kinds of things. That's reflected in this ABC News Ipsos poll. When people are asked how they feel about the U.S. economy, 75% say not so good or poor. Byron, there's still a disconnect.
There is. I mean, first of all, we should say it really is good news, not just for the country, but it's good news for Joe Biden. It is good news for Democrats who are going to try to keep control of Congress in the fall. But there is this persistent inflation worry. It is eating away at people's quality of life. Wages went up, actually, 5.7% over last year. You think, well, that's really good, but that has been eaten up entirely and more by inflation. So that's why you have those bad feelings about the economy, and it looks like they will persist as we get closer and closer to the elections.
So, Kimberly, we all want positive news for our economy, and we want people to feel successful and like they can put food on the table and those kinds of things. But from a strictly political viewpoint, will this turn around in time to impact the midterms, which Byron mentioned?
I don't think it's going to. And again, look, a couple of other good things from those numbers. I think one of the things what you're seeing here is that people feel the need to go back to work, which, by the way, could be feeding into why they're not happy, right? But they're running out of all that savings that they had saved up during the pandemic. And you're seeing an end to a lot of those transfer payments, in particular the enhanced child tax credit that was out there. So they're incentivized to go back to work. But I don't see necessarily how the underlying conditions that are currently what's feeding inflation change much in the coming months. That's disconnected from these job numbers, because what's going into that is government spending, which has continued, supply chain, but also signals out of this administration that they're going to continue pushing for more regulations and higher costs, all of which are things that businesses have to absorb and pass on to consumers.
Josh, your take on the numbers?
Yeah, I think one of the more underappreciated parts of the report is that the reason the report beat expectations so much is that people went back to work despite all the worries about Omicron. And the expectation, the conventional wisdom was that people would be staying in their homes, leaving their jobs, not trying to go back to work. And it turns out that most of the country has gotten over Omicron, and that was a big part in these really good jobs numbers. And I think it's a political lesson for the Biden administration that if they start talking past the pandemic, if they get out of this emergency phase and start talking to the public about getting back to normal, it may have a very positive impact on the economy. It certainly showed in these reports, but they seem to be still stuck in this very cautionary posture that's only hurting the economy and maybe hurting their political fortunes.
Okay, let's shift to the Olympics kicking off in Beijing, in China, as President Xi and Vladimir Putin are getting together and yucking it up. And the world is sort of divided over whether they're even going to watch or support this thing, and whether or not our athletes in free countries like the U.S. should be saying anything about it. Here's the House Speaker today with her advice for our athletes.
Do not risk incurring the anger of the Chinese government because they are ruthless. I know there is a temptation on the part of some to speak out while they are there. I respect that, but I also worry about what the Chinese government might do to their reputations, to their families.
Kimberly, what do you make of that advice?
Well, she has to say it because it's a reality. I mean, look, we have this remarkable situation where we have the government advising people to take burner phones, our athletes, because they're worried that the Chinese are going to spy on them. And I lay a lot of blame for this on the IOC and its decision to go to China. You know, they always have this attitude, well, we can't ignore any countries in the world or big countries, especially if they're offering to host. But they're the people who end up putting our athletes in this situation, free governments in this situation, broadcasters that are like who's looking after the Olympics and having to decide whether or not to call out the abuse in the country. It's really an awkward position for everybody.
Josh, what do you make of one of the standard bearers there in China? They chose a Uyghur athlete, obviously with the world accusing them, many countries, of genocide, of trying to wipe out an entire minority there in China. What do you make of that selection? Yeah,
I think it's a lot more for show than it says anything about their horrid human rights abuses. I agree with Kimberly that the fact that you're not hearing from corporate sponsors, you're not hearing from the television sponsors as explicitly as you should about the human rights abuses that have been taking place across the country. It really is. I know the United States has called for and implemented a diplomatic boycott, but it's a very, very weird situation and an awkward Olympics where we have our athletes there. They're at risk of Chinese improprieties, and you have a corporate community that hasn't said much of a word about any of these human rights abuses.
Yeah, Byron, what about that? Because we have a lot of U.S. corporations that have been very vocal the last few years over perceived inequities and social injustices and things that right here in the U.S., they've been very clear about taking a position on, and yet many of them are enabling in China, sponsoring, without making those same distinctions or complaints about things that need to be made right.
Absolutely. The double standard seems to be off the scale. And I understand that Americans need to be cautious in this, but, Speaker Pelosi's advice to American athletes is really going to rub a lot of Americans the wrong way, that we're sending athletes over there and they can't even speak out. So Olympics have always been politicized. This one seems to be just to a new degree, and I think we're always going to remember it as this heavily, heavily politicized event.
Yeah, Senator Ben Sasse, Republican, is one of the many who are pointing out the concerns they have about things like apps that travelers and athletes are being forced to download and what China will eventually do potentially with that. So those concerns there as well. All right, I want to start with your winners and losers. Byron, kick us off.
My loser is Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister. A new report shows that when Britain was locked down with COVID, you could barely go out and see each other. The Prime Minister and his staff it was party time at number 10. Looks really, really bad. My winner just happened this afternoon. Former Vice President Mike Pence said that President Trump was wrong to think that the Vice President could overturn the presidential election on January 6th. Trump has been pushing Pence about this, and today he pushed back.
Myron, just real quick follow-up. Do you think that Boris Johnson survives this? Is he in trouble?
It looks really, really bad. He's had top aides resign for a number of reasons, and the only reason you think he might survive is that he has this kind of amazing ability to pull himself out of messes that he creates.
Okay. All right, Josh.
So my winner is Judge Rochelle Childs of South Carolina, one of the judges on Biden's shortlist for the Supreme Court. She's got Jim Clyburn's endorsement and Lindsey Graham's. And if President Biden wants to get bipartisan support, if he wants to get a lot of, or at least some Republican votes, she would be a pretty smart choice to get this administration back on a more pragmatic political path. As far as losers go, Governor Kathy Hochul of New York is facing a lot of criticism over a lot of things, but namely the crime issue. She's not listened to Eric Adams about trying to restore bail for violent criminals.
All right.
She's aligned herself with the DA in Manhattan. She's got a real race on her hands in 2022.
All right, Kimberly, we'll let you pick either your winner or your loser, unless it's the same person.
No, my winner are the very brave special forces who went into Syria to help take out the Islamic leader. Drones are great, but these guys helped save a lot of lives, and we owe them a debt.
We absolutely do. All right, panel, thank you very much.